Good afternoon, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. It's my pleasure to have you here today. I'm Deb Hackathorn. I'm Senior Vice President for Government Affairs for Civic Point here in Columbus, and I'm a member of the Columbus Metropolitan Board of Trustees. Today's forum sponsor are our good friends at Hannah News Service. Thank you, Hannah. And our live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. Let's thank all of those that support today's forum. On to the show. With the results of the latest census in hand, lawmakers across the country are now redrawing the lines of 429 U.S. House districts and over 7,000 state legislative districts. Today, we're going to explore the implications of redistricting on elections here in Ohio and what redrawn legislative maps will mean to Ohio voters. Please join me in welcoming today's speakers. On my far left, Terry Casey, Republican consultant and former Ohio elections official. Sam Gresham, owner and principal of Samuel Gresham International and chairman of Common Cause Ohio. Kyle Kondik, author of The Long Red Thread, How Democratic Dominance Gave Way to Republican Advantage in U.S. House Elections, and managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball. And yes, the books are in the back of the room. And finally, Jen Miller, executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Our host to lead today's conversation will be Jesse Balmer, reporter with USA Today Network Ohio Bureau, who's been writing about this topic, as we've noted, every day or multiple times a day. So with that, I turn it over to Jesse.
Thanks, Deb. So we have about 30 minutes for questions that I'm going to ask these fine panelists, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from everybody in this room. So I want to try to cover both state maps and redistricting and also congressional redistricting, which we're coming up on right now. So we have a lovely panel of a bunch of pretty cool political nerds and junkies up here. So my first question to you is, why should the average Ohioan care about redistricting? We'll just start with Jen and go down.
Well, thank you, Jesse. First, I just want to say thanks to Jane and Lainey, Hannah News, Columbus Foundation, Dispatch, all the members and supporters. Programs like this are so critical. Why should we care about legislative maps? They can last up to 10 years, and they literally mean who represents us in the State House, who represents us in Congress. When they're rigged, which means they are designed mathematically to benefit one party or candidate, it takes away voter choice for all of us. That's why the League of Women Voters of Ohio has been fighting partisan gerrymandering for over 40 years, both when Democrats and Republicans have rigged the maps here in Ohio. Why? Because what we need and want are districts that are designed to really keep communities whole, where we're not just slicing and dicing neighborhoods and communities simply for selfish partisan advantage, which unfortunately is a long tradition here in Ohio, and we're seeing that play out again this year.
One of the trends that we've seen in elections, both at the state house level in Ohio and elsewhere, and also at the congressional level, is that I think, unfortunately, probably the candidates and the issues maybe don't matter quite as much as simply the kind of partisan makeup of the districts, because voters are becoming more kind of straight ticket in terms of how they vote. Particularly if there's a presidential or statewide election, you're seeing more and more of kind of a lack of ticket splitting in those races and people not really distinguishing between the candidates. And so how the districts have been drawn has always mattered as to who wins and who loses in a certain district. But I would argue it probably matters more now than it used to, because some of the factors that I think helped candidates distinguish themselves in the past are maybe no longer as important or potent in our elections. And so again, that to me raises the stakes of this process, again, here at the state level, at the State House, but also for Congress.
Thank you very much. I was there in 2000. I was there in 2005, and I'm back now in 2010. I don't think I'm gonna make the next redistricting council. I'm a little old. But I don't think the Republican Party understands the corner that it's in with regards to this redistricting effort. Let me give you some things you need to look at when you look at this redistricting effort. You have to look at the national push that's going to come between December and June of next year to pass the John Lewis and the American Act. What they will do will transform the whole process of election across the country. You also have to look at what I call Groundhog Day. And let me explain to you what I mean. Tom Hanks did a movie called Groundhog Day. And Groundhog required that they do the same thing every day for those people. Well, the Republican Party is in a maze where they're going to have to do everything every 3 years because we have a 4-year map. They're going to have to go through this process. Along that way, somebody's going to figure out that this is stupid. And somebody's going to say, how ignorant, how repulsive is it that we are going to deny attributes in our Constitution? They're going to see how arrogant these people are with regards to what they thought. Now, Dennis Franklin said something. I don't know if you know who Dennis Franklin is. He's a former coach of the Minnesota Vikings. And he went on television and said, with a game to the Chicago Bears, they were who we thought they were. And let me clarify that. We figured they would be that arrogant. We figured that they would figure they could overrun us. We figured that they would put themselves in this box. Every 36 months, they have to go to the Supreme Court. Every 36 months, they have to start a new process. That every 36 months, they have to start it all over again. Think of the chaos that's going to occur for incumbents and candidates. Now, I know Terry's going to follow me, and he's going to tell me that that's not the truth. Well, I'm going to tell you it's not a sustainable strategy, responding this way to the changes in the Constitution.
Well, the one thing for certain is that the process is not as simple as just putting some numbers in a computer and pushing a button, because if you read the Ohio Constitution, the actual amendment that was passed, they've got some different criteria as far as counties or cities or townships held whole. And the good news is on the state legislative map, it was relatively easy because in some cases, counties have a plus or minus 10% population factor, or in other districts 5%, but the congressional gets even more complicated because in Ohio there's only going to be 15 districts because we've shrunk. Not too far back in 1990 we had 21 districts for the whole state, so we're down to 15, and each district's got to be 786,630 people. Not plus or minus 10 people or 20 people. There have been some recent court rulings, and this complicates the process, that maybe gives a little population variance. But if you thought the state legislative map was challenging, the congressional is going to be even more so because of what you split. And again, it's a matter of following the Constitution, and some people, we'll talk about it later, will quote a section of the Constitution, but then forget sections 2, 3, 4, and 5 that's before it. So I wish it was simple. I wish it was easy. It's not. And here's another little secret. There'll be incumbent members of Congress, both Democrat and Republican, who are unhappy with the maps they get because incumbents always want better districts where they get higher percentages. So the games are on, and it'll be interesting, and it won't be boring, and it'll always be changing, and then there's the courts.
To be sure. So there's a few reasons why you should read all of my nice articles about redistricting. So going to focus a little bit on the state maps that we just got done, passing the Ohio Redistricting Commission on a partisan vote of 5-2 approved maps for the Ohio State House that would give Republicans about a 62-37 advantage in the House, about 23-10 in the Ohio Senate that maintains a veto-proof majority in both of those chambers. My question for Jen, voters approved changes to the redistricting process, and yet we missed deadlines. Most of the work was done behind closed doors. Have these initiatives lived up to the promises made to voters?
So first off, I would say it's not the initiatives that failed, but the map makers failed to live up to the promise that they made to voters. So let's back up. You know, the 2015 amendment to the Constitution, we had our clipboards out. We were going to get onto the ballot, and we decided to work with the Ohio Republican Party and the Ohio Democratic Party and the Ohio General Assembly to craft reforms. We actually kept walking away from the negotiating table because we were concerned that politicians would put their own interests first. But then we decided we should negotiate, and we were hoping that everyone's better angels would prevail, in that those folks, you know, the spirit of this reform, which is about bipartisanship and transparency and public engagement, that would carry through in the implementation now. That's not what we saw. We saw hearings that were scheduled last minute and without maps for people to testify on during the day, often in places where it was hard to park. We saw lots more conversations appearing to be behind closed doors than in the hearings themselves. Even the hearings were hard because you didn't even have maps up on the screen to point to what you wanted to see changed. And so we are gravely disappointed. The process was unfair, and the maps are absolutely rigged. These are as bad, if not worse, than our previous partisan gerrymanders. And here's where we are at League. We want representation for all, not some. And we want voters to get the chance to elect the politicians, the candidates of their choice. And so what I would say is that we're still in the midst of that process because at least we have the ability to go to the courts for reprieve. And that is also a part of the 2015 reform, and that's why we are before the Ohio Supreme Court. Clearly, when you have 3 different cases all arguing that it's partisan gerrymandering, and especially when one of those groups is mine, the League of Women Voters, that has fought in the courts both against partisan Republican gerrymanders and partisan Democratic gerrymanders, we feel that there's a strong case, and so we'll see what happens with the courts. If the courts overturn this and really require better maps, I would say that the initiatives succeeded despite the terrible efforts of map makers to put their selfish interests first.
Thanks. I'm going to direct this next question to Terry and to Sam. If you were grading the Ohio Redistricting Commission's map making on state House and Senate districts on an A to F grade, what would you assign, and briefly why?
I'm going to take a politician's prerogative and punt and say incomplete, because until we get an idea of how the Supreme Court, which is also somewhat divided politically, but also people forget Maureen O'Connor voted against the last plan 10 years ago, so she's not always going to be a rubber stamp vote. So it's incomplete because it won't be till December that they have the oral arguments before the Ohio Supreme Court, and obviously we've delayed, rightly or wrongly, the congressional map making, in part because with 3 lawsuits pending on the state legislative districts, you don't want to get too far out front in doing the congressional until you got a better idea which way does the court lean. And both amendments are somewhat similar, but there are certain technical differences in there in terms of what you can split and what you can't split, which is, Jesse's done a great job in her reporting, but it's hard to explain every little nuance that's in the Ohio, or the constitutional amendment of the state.
What about you, Sam?
I'd give them an F+.
Not an F-, right?
They tried. You know, I may make fun of this, but it's not really funny. It is like disenfranchising people in a very painful way. It hurts when you find out that your vote does not count. It hurts when you find out that you waiting as a part of your growth process to exercise your franchise that it has been manipulated. It's not funny. It hurts. It disenfranchises people who have a right to do that. Now, I'm going to go to some technical points because Terry likes that. There are parts of the 15th Amendment, the VAR, which is the Voting Rights Act, that strongly indicate you cannot discriminate against people of color, minority groups. What they have produced in these two maps is a scandal in what they've done. Now, they did this before, and we knew they were going to do it. If you understood the snake on the lake, Cleveland to Toledo, the 15th House District, Upper Arlington to Athens, what do they have in common with each other? So we anticipated they were going to do this. Now, Jen didn't say this. Our additional ammunition that we have is, for the last 5 years, we've been holding contests to put maps together that are balanced and fair. What is that television station called? Balanced and Fair? We've been holding these contests for more than 5 years under the name of the League of Women Voters. We know how to do it. Finally, the group I'm associated with provided a map and a book on what the map could look like for the General Assembly. We are also preparing a map and a book to give to the Apportionment Board. Now, if you understand, this is additional evidence that can be used in a court trial to say that it can be done.
Next question I'm going to direct to Kyle. There's a provision in the ballot initiatives for both the state house districts and the congressional districts that maintains if you can't reach a compromise, you have a 4-year map instead of a 10-year map. Is a 4-year map a penalty or an advantage for map makers?
So I think it's actually an advantage, because what happens with these districts is that, you give a census every 10 years, and, the map makers, whatever their goals are, if they're gerrymandering for Democrats or Republicans or whatever, they're going to, look at the state of things now, and they're going to try to design a map that sort of maximizes their number of seats over the course of a decade. And while American voting behavior is in some ways more predictable than it used to be, there's still a churn in the electorate. Every election, things change. Different places trend certain ways. We've seen that in Ohio in ways that have been overall beneficial to Republicans, but there are certain places that have become more Democratic. Like Franklin County is a good example. It's gone from being, blue county 10, 15 years ago to a super blue county now. Delaware County, north of Columbus, that used to be a blood red Republican county. Now it's a much less red Republican county. Likewise, Eastern Ohio, places like Greater Youngstown and Warren along the Ohio River used to be Democratic or kind of purple areas, now have become really Republican. So if those things change over the course of 10 years. So for instance, Tim Ryan's district, Democrat running for Senate, who represents a district that snakes from Akron to Youngstown, that district was drawn to be a safe Democratic vote sink, basically. The Republicans packed as many Democrats as they could find into that district to safely elect Tim Ryan. Well, because of the changes we saw over the course of the decade in that part of the state, Joe Biden only won that district by a few points in the last election when Barack Obama had won it by almost 30. Likewise, we had a really close special election in Ohio's 12th congressional district, which covers Delaware County and some of the northern Columbus suburbs and some rural areas. So these things change over the course of time. However, if you have the opportunity to go back and draw a new map every 4 years instead of every 10, you could actually better account for some of these changes. And so in some ways, if we fall into this pattern in Ohio where instead of drawing a map every 10 years, we draw one every 4, and the Republicans continue to have the advantages they do in the process, that could actually help them, make better maps for themselves on a more regular basis. One just overall kind of national point about this is that this is at the congressional level. There's no federal prohibition that says, hey, congressional maps can only be drawn once every 10 years. Now, some states have laws that prevent that from happening in their own states, but others don't. A famous example was you all may remember this, you followed politics for a long time. Texas Republicans finally took control of that state into the 2002 elections, and they drew a new Republican gerrymander in 2003 to replace an old map that was functionally an old Democratic gerrymander that had been imposed by the courts. And Texas was allowed to do that because there was no provision in Texas that prevented that from happening. But so, you could see this, multiple maps, in different states, over the course of different years. I think back in the late 1800s, Ohio had like 6 congressional maps over the course of 15 years or something. It's happened in the past. It's just that it hasn't happened as regularly as often. But the way the Ohio system is now set up is that it might actually incentivize creating more maps on a more frequent basis. And that might actually be good for the party in power.
I just wanted to jump in. One thing that we all need to watch, and I encourage you to contact Ohio's lawmakers at the federal level, is actually federal redistricting reform. So keep in mind that there is legislation right now that's pending that would require independent commissions rather than politicians to make our congressional districts. If that passes and we have a 4-year map, we would see a real true level playing field for creating maps. And so I would actually argue to the map makers today that a 4-year map might mean that while, yeah, maybe the lines grow stale and you can just gerrymander even better 4 years from now, it could also mean that they no longer have control over the process.
Sounds good. Checking my time here, I want to move on to congressional maps so we have time to discuss that. Obviously, the state house maps are before the Ohio Supreme Court. There are 3 different lawsuits, and I think we're going to be all watching very carefully to see what they decide on those. As far as the congressional maps, the Ohio Redistricting Commission, Speaker Cupp said yesterday that they are not going to pass a map. That kicks the process back to Ohio lawmakers. And to get a 10-year map, they need to get 60% of all members in both chambers, and then 33% of the minority party, which is the Democrats, to sign on to a map. If not, they can pass a 4-year map with a simple majority, which Republicans certainly enjoy in Ohio, and they must provide an explanation as to why this doesn't favor or disfavor other parties. So, as our panelists have pointed out, Ohio is going to lose a congressional district. I will pitch this to Kyle, but other people can answer. Is it possible under Ohio's new rules for the GOP to pick up a seat, make a 13-2 map, and then secondarily, which incumbents could be drawn together?
It is possible. Now, the way that the rules for the congressional line drawing process is that a large number of counties, I think it's like the 67 or 68 smallest counties, can't be split, and the most a county can be split is 2 times. But there are lots of people on so-called election Twitter who draw maps in Dave's Redistricting app, which is this easy-to-use software in which you could draw your own congressional maps. And it's pretty easy to draw a map that technically abides by the rules, but produces effectively a 13-2 Republican advantage, which is a single Democratic seat in Cleveland and a single Democratic seat here in Columbus. I mentioned Tim Ryan's district. Of course, Tim Ryan is running for Senate right now. Only he knows precisely why he ran for Senate, but I have to imagine that part of the reason for the thinking is that he probably would not have a district to run in, because logically it makes the most sense because population growth in Eastern Ohio has been so stagnant, for that district to be eliminated. I mean, again, it was a vote drawn to safely elect Democrats. It's not even that Democratic anymore, and it would be very easy, particularly from a Republican perspective, to just rip apart that district and dole it out to surrounding Republican districts. Marcia Kaptur, the long-serving Democrat from the Toledo area, who represents the so-called Snake on the Lake district that goes from Toledo all the way to Westside Cleveland. She defeated Dennis Kucinich in a member versus member primary a decade ago. I'm thinking that a new district will probably be more Toledo-centric, but it can be drawn in such a way that it probably would elect a Republican, although maybe Kaptur's been around so long that she might have a chance to survive in that sort of scenario. And then there's also a question, if the Republicans decided that they didn't want to go full board a 13-2, but then maybe would draw like a 12-3 map, something like that, you probably would have a 3rd Democratic seat in Cincinnati. And Hamilton County is such, it's become a relatively Democratic county that it's just a little bit bigger than a single congressional district. So if you drew just a single Hamilton County-based seat, probably would elect a Democrat, which would imperil Steve Shabbat, who's the current Republican incumbent there. But it is somewhat convenient that we're losing a seat, but Tim Ryan is not running for re-election. So hypothetically, you could have a situation where the others return. But again, I think that Capter in particular, she might find herself in a Republican-leaning district. Again, depending on how this shakes out. And of course, this Ohio Supreme Court is important here. And my understanding, and if anyone disagrees with this, let me know if I'm misreading it, but the Ohio Supreme Court has a little more power in the congressional process because I think that they can actually effectively draw the map, whereas in the state legislative process, it just gets kicked back to the commission. I don't know if I'm misstating that, let me know. But so the Supreme Court is important in both, but particularly for congressional.
Can I respond to some aspects of both of those presentations? It's interesting that people who analyze politics always think people are drones and that they have amnesia. 70% of the people in Ohio voted twice to redraw the process of the district. 70%. That includes Republicans. All right? All right. The other part of that is we are in a transformational period in the history of this country. Most people may not recognize it right away, but the election of a black woman as vice president, how Biden won the election in Georgia, are all significant indicators that things are changing. That's why I call it a transformational year. The Democratic Party cannot allow the Republicans to pass those voter oppression laws. It will devastate the Democratic Party. There will be no party of Democrats in the Ohio or anywhere else in the country if they let those laws pass. The future of their party is baked into the John Lewis and the Freedom Act of America. And you better, once they pass these infrastructure bills, there's going to be a slew of people putting so much pressure on them from the African American community, starting right after Christmas. We got to have our Christmas. And they also realize that if they let this pass, their party is doomed. That's why I have so much comfort and faith. Now, the final thing I'll throw as my evidence, I can't wait to see Donald Trump on the 2024 candidacy for president. I just can't wait. There must be a lot of dumb people. 700,000 people killed. I can go on with the litany of stuff. Americans are not that dumb, and they're not that forgetful.
Jesse, back to your original question, is it possible to have a 13-2 map? And the answer is, in a way, anything is possible, but the probability is very low because people understand that certain of these indexes that are quoted are indexes and they vary from election to election. And I'll give you an example. In Ohio, in 2001, Republicans controlled the legislative map. They drew the districts to favor Republicans, but then in 2008, it ended up Democrats got control of the Ohio House of Representatives. Armand Budish was Speaker. So certain of these indexes will indicate things, but the indexes are not perfect. In some cases, they aren't even that close in terms of what they come up with. So the part of the lesson is if you get greedy and try and do too much, maybe it works out for you in 2022, but then in 2024 with a different tide going on nationally, politically, it might suddenly you find out you made some big mistakes if you get too greedy.
Jen, could you maybe clarify what the Ohio Supreme Court can do on congressional districts that they can't do on state maps?
You know what, am I on? Yeah, I'm still on. I actually don't want to because I would like to talk to my lawyers first. So sometimes people think I am one on TV, but I'm not. So But what I would say is this. A 13-2 map would be a partisan gerrymander, and that would end up in the Ohio Supreme Court, I'm quite sure.
not respond either to my lawyers because I'm a plaintiff in one of the suits, so I can't respond to that question. But boy, look at my face.
One other thing, and again, to sort of place Ohio in a national context, is that, I think gerrymandering reform or redistricting reform is sort of an idea whose time has come, in that you do see that when these ballot issues do get to voters, that they often approve them, and often approve them by a lot. Now, sometimes the process that gets approved as a way to try to reform the way the lines are drawn maybe doesn't work the way that's hoped, or that the reformers hope, and that we may be seeing that in Ohio. But again, the Ohio Supreme Court is going to rule on that. In Virginia, I work for the University of Virginia, voters approved a new commission system there, and the commission basically has failed. It was a mix of legislators and regular citizens, and it was split between the parties, and they just really couldn't get much progress done on anything, be it the state legislative maps or the congressional maps. And so even though there is progress toward maybe making this process a little bit less political, even trying to do these reforms can be very difficult, as I think we're seeing in Ohio, and we've seen in other places. But I do think there's an appetite for that amongst voters, because if you look at polling and whatnot, generally speaking, people really of both parties, maybe Democrats more than Republicans, but there is a lot of support, sort of generically speaking, for trying to hem in and put some limits on partisan gerrymandering. It's just a question of how you do it. And it's going to take some time, I think, to figure out exactly what sort of system works the best.
Terry, I'm going to appeal to you as a Republican member here. In 2011, John Boehner loomed large over this process. Even his staffers were recommending specific changes for Jane Timken, who's now a U.S. Senate candidate. How involved have members of Congress been this time around? Who are kind of the power players that we need to be watching for in Ohio congressional redistricting?
Well, members of Congress are not shy, particularly this time of year. They find reasons to drop by in Columbus and call people they know. And obviously, some of the members of Congress are former legislators, which mean they know people. But members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, and then people who have aspirations. People forget in 2011, when Franklin County, and I happen to live in Clintonville, amazingly on the map, right across the street from where Mary Jo Kilroy lived, they drew a little finger that picked up Dave Leland's house, just literally on her front porch. Mary Jo Kilroy could see the 3rd District, but it was a little finger because Dave Leland, who's very well connected and very smart, wanted to be in the 3rd District. And then other people wanted things. So members of Congress, people who want to be members of Congress, they express opinions, but that's part of the reason why I said earlier there'll be both Democrats and Republicans unhappy that they don't have a good enough district, or unhappy that they've got to represent that area because maybe the people there don't like them as much. So we don't have a Speaker of the U.S. House who would have as much influence as John Boehner did at that time. But there's still going to be a lot of lobbying, both Democrats and Republicans. And Joyce Beatty obviously is very interested in how her district's drawn here, and her district is one of them that's gained population, and she can't have all of the city of Columbus because Columbus is a lot bigger than the 786 number that I quoted earlier. So yes, members of Congress, you might, if you hang out at the State House, you might see them around, or if you were tapping the phones, you'd hear them calling a lot.
So I'm going to ask one final question from my list, but if you would like to ask questions either on the live stream or in person, you can make your way to the microphone now. As a former Cincinnati Enquirer exclusive reporter, I'm going to ask a parochial question, but I think it is a good place of the state to be watching for these maps. Under the new rules, Cincinnati must be kept whole. Is it still possible to draw 2 GOP congressional districts in Hamilton County? Would that violate voter-approved changes? Either Kyle or Jen, maybe?
My understanding is that you could, because you could sort of link Cincinnati and send the kind of as the district is sort of drawn now. You could link Cincinnati with places sort of north and east of it that are much more Republican, and you could probably draw it in such a way that would be a Republican-leaning district, and then you'd give the rest of Hamilton County to, or you'd link the rest of Hamilton County with some of the other, northern Cincinnati suburbs, go up along the Indiana border. So, what exactly it would look like, I don't know, but I think it can be done.
I would agree with Kyle. Can be done, but people also forget districts can be a major factor, but the kind of political year you have is also a major factor. And then there's this old-fashioned thing of candidates really do matter. And I give you the 15th district as an example, when Mary Jo Kilroy and Debbie Price had literally a photo finish, but Deborah won, then Deborah didn't run, and it was a photo finish in Stivers versus Mary Jo Kilroy. And then the following time they matched up again, and Stivers won by 13 points. So candidates and candidate years make a difference too. So as much as, again, people cite certain indexes show X or Y is not something that's a certificate of election that guarantees somebody wins or loses in a lot of the districts. Not all of them, but a lot.
I'd like to break a couple things down here. So first off, 10 years ago, there was something called Project Red Map, which is where the RNC actually worked in states across the country that had Republican majorities making the maps. And so there was an intense goal to cement partisan supermajorities in states across the country, not just Ohio. So this idea that maybe the RNC isn't leaning in Ohio because we don't have Boehner, I think doesn't necessarily prove true. From past experience. Another thing I just wanted to point out is the emails from this between what was called Team Boehner and the map makers actually called parts of downtown and Grandview dog meat voting territory because it leaned to Democrat. So I want to just say this, it maybe seems a little innocuous when it's just, some Congress folks some congressional members just happen to get into Columbus and be really verbal. But I want to be real clear that no voter should ever be considered dog meat. And that's exactly what happened 10 years ago, which I think shows us what happens when politicians are the ones rigging these maps. And then finally, I just want to point out that in the last 10 years, we do have emails that show that the goal was a 12-4 map, 12 Republican, 4 Democrats. And in the last 10 years, that was perfect. We would call that a perfect partisan gerrymander. So maybe candidates matter a little bit, but this map has been mathematically insulated from voter preferences, as we've seen even when the state went for Obama, 12-4. When the state went for Trump, 12-4. That shows us that what the map makers wanted was a supermajority that guaranteed partisan outcomes. That hurts every voter, because when you guarantee those partisan outcomes, elected officials don't need to listen to their voters. Instead, they play to party extremes and major donors. That's what their goal was, and that's what happened. And when that happens, candidates don't matter the way they should.
Let me jump in on that too. The group that put that together is called ALEX. And if you've ever heard of ALEX, most of the legislative stuff that we're getting on voter suppression, guess where it comes from? ALEX also. Now, the maps that we had drawn for our presentation to the apportionment board had opportunity zones. And what opportunity zones mean in the parlance is there's a possibility, there's an opportunity for a person of color to win this district or to be competitive in this district. Guess what we found? There were 2 opportunity districts in Hamilton County, 2 opportunity districts in Franklin County, and 2 opportunity districts in Cuyahoga County. Now, we drew the map based on the criteria and taking in consider voter rights laws and what the 15th Amendment said, how we should do this. And I want to remind you that racial gerrymandering is illegal. So any way you do it, we can have opportunities if we want them.
I think we're going to get to the audience questions now. It's Columbus Metro Club's longstanding tradition of taking audience questions. So we're going to curate those, and I think go ahead.
Thank you. I have quite a few online, and what we'll do here in the room, we'll do every other one. So if you all have questions, just get up here, and I'll take turns. The first question is from Ben Anthony, who is at the Ohio History Connection. It appears that any built-in mechanisms to encourage bipartisanship in the process has failed. Are the stakes for political control in an already polarized climate just too high? Does this process need political punishment rather than incentives to drive legitimate bipartisanship? And does the entire process need to be removed from elected leaders' hands? So there's 3 questions, and you take your pick.
Happy to jump in. And hi, Ben. I'm also a board member of the Ohio History Connection. So good question. I'll just say this. The League of Women Voters since the 70s in Ohio has wanted an independent commission. And I think that we wanted to try to see if the better angels could prevail here and both parties could work together and politicians could actually serve voters. We're not seeing that. So let's see if the courts actually rule in the favor of the voters and we get different maps. That means the initiatives still worked. If not, then I think absolutely, and maybe either way, we might need to consider another ballot initiative. And so for those of you that have your clipboards, get ready, because we might have to get them out and get politicians out of this process.
Let me say that Common Cause on the national level wanted to see the better angels too, see if it was possible. But see, what has happened, again, the Republicans have themselves in a corner. I used to run an organization where we used to test discrimination. Let me tell you what we do. We sent out a white tester, we sent out a black tester. We sent out a black tester and another white tester. We have 3 on each side. Then we accumulate the information from the behavior and what they were told. Then we formulated our case for discrimination to go to the state of Ohio and then finally to the federal courts. Guess what we did in this process? We created a process that allowed the legislators to maintain control of the process with some guardrails. And guess what they did? I told you in the beginning, we knew who they were. So now we have tons of evidence that we can now compile and go at a series of court cases to prove that we have to take this out of their hands.
Just to chime in, one little item that one of the reasons why in June of 19, the U.S. Supreme Court somewhat punted on jumping into too much of gerrymandering, legal, illegal, what's right, what's wrong, is there's this little thing called the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, that basically says the manner of holding elections shall be prescribed by each state's legislature. Now, Congress could make some changes. Ohio could change its constitution, but part of it is, rightly or wrongly, going back to Mr. Madison, they put it in the Constitution that each state's legislature shall do it. And obviously, if Congress or the people decide they want to change it, they can change it, but that's one of the reasons, because in my view, and the Washington Post last month did a very comprehensive article of, because Congress today is what, 3-vote advantage to the Democrats, it's so close, and the battle for who controls Congress, you've got certain Democrat states wanting to gerrymander one way, Republicans another way. Until Congress or the people change the Constitution, it's going to be in the hands of the legislature.
And just to jump in on that,
Sam, can we move
Section-
on to the next question?
all right, okay.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
I'll take another question.
Yeah, I'm sure, I have faith.
Hopefully this will, you can come in on this question. Ann Gabriel, Ohio University, retired. One of the, I think the worst byproducts of gerrymandering is it seems we've pushed our candidates to the extremes of both parties. So as an independent, moderate, I vote against people far more than I vote for people. So is there any hope of more moderate positions and compromise does not become the bad word that it is today?
Good question. The foundation of democracy is compromise. But we've gone to a place of zero-sum game. When we control the House, the Senate, the governor, or the president, we do what we want. Compromise. Somebody else said it out there. So we're at a transformational point. Are we really a democracy, or are we this corrupt, ruthless government that waits for the autocracy or the mob to take control? Which are we? African Americans have loved and fought and died for this country. But this country has not always loved African Americans. But we keep trying because we think it's a blue marble in the ether out there that has the only chance. And I'll end with a final comment. This is an experiment. No multiracial economic and military power has ever existed in the history of this world. So at any time, wrong thing happened, this thing could go down.
Yes, we get to a point where we have fair districts. I think we would see that we wouldn't have the same partisan extremes. So over time, if you look back to 1972, the more gerrymandered Congress became, the less overlap there was on floor votes. And so what that means is fewer and fewer people. So in the 70s, we have lots of Republicans kind of siding with Democrats, Democrats siding with Republicans. Over time, it's gotten more and more extreme. I think on any issue here, if we all sat down, even if we, gun safety, reproductive choice, healthcare, the general public of Ohio would come up with solutions that neither our congressional delegation nor our Ohio State House can, because we don't think in the same partisan ways. So you are right. We are seeing these extreme partisan supermajorities as well as secure seats means that candidates and therefore then elected officials play to those party extremes, play to their donors, and not to the way the general Ohioan thinks, who's more independent like you and I.
Just to take a slightly different tact on this, it's pretty clear that the parties have sort of moved apart and gotten more ideological over the course of the last few decades. But I think gerrymandering is sometimes blamed for that, but gerrymandering doesn't exist in the Senate. You'll still see that in the Senate, and I think you see it at the presidential and gubernatorial level either. And district drawing doesn't necessarily play a role in that. So the other thing too is that even if you did have a fair districting process, and again, reasonable people can sort of come up with their own ideas as to what the best way to do that is, you would still have a lot of safe districts though, because you're not going to draw a district in downtown Cleveland or downtown Columbus or lots of rural Ohio, and it's not. I think you could aspire to have more districts that are more two-party competitive, but all of them are not going to be two-party competitive. It's just the geography of the state and and all over the country too. I mean, again, I think we could do better, and I do think that having a ton of safe seats does create some perverse incentives toward not compromising and what have you. But gerrymandering reform isn't necessarily going to eliminate those sorts of problems.
Hugo Trucks asks, is there a constitutional issue with which to fight disenfranchisement via gerrymandering? And I'm not sure I even understand that question. Is there a constitutional issue with which to fight disenfranchisement via gerrymandering?
Yeah, so in the U.S. Constitution, we use 1 in 14, so which is about kind of equal protection. In the state case, the constitutional amendment we're using is Section 6, which really talks about kind of that the seat share of how many seats each party gets should closely mirror the percentage of votes each party gets. So that's where we are now. That doesn't mean we couldn't get stronger. One thing I wanted to mention about this idea that the U.S. Constitution would require state legislatures to create the maps. There's actually 8 states that have independent redistricting commissions already. That includes, of course, Michigan, most recently, Colorado, Arizona, Montana, quite a few. And so Ohio could go that way, and you could argue that that wouldn't be in violation of the U.S. Constitution.
Cleve Ricksecker. I've observed the Republican Party being radicalized over the last, I don't know how many years, 10 years or so. A lot of good Republicans leaving the State House, people leaving the party. Are there any examples in the country of where gerrymandering has radicalized a party so much that the party lost power because of that? Or are we in this for the long haul in Ohio? In other words, is there any limit to how radicalized the Republican Party can get?
Clear example yet, but let me give you something that you need to think about. It's called demographics. And I want you to understand that in the state of Texas, Caucasians are only 40% of the voting population. Let me say that to you again. 40%. That means there's another 60% out there that is really the majority, but look how they treat voting. Let me say to you, the states of Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, population is growing in such a way that within the next 30 years, the majority populations in those states will be people of color. Now, the foundation of democracy now has a problem. We say we want everybody to vote, but when Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia become primarily a black state, we now have to test ourselves to say, do we really want that? And that's what this whole thing is about. People don't want to say that. They call it power and privilege. It's about race. Because Mexicans, African Americans, Filipinos, Somalians in this town, we have a Somalian population that's only second to Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Those populations are growing. You look at the birth rate. The Pew Foundation says the majority of students in high school right now, regardless of public or private, are people of color. With those types of things and facts facing you, we anticipated the behavior that we're getting now in Ohio and across the country.
Kyle, is there any state that you can think of that, gerrymandering kind of backfired on a political party?
I don't know about gerrymandering in particular, but I do think that there are some examples of states that just as the state was becoming more and more competitive, the party in power became more and more, the ones I can think of are Republican states like Arizona and Virginia, I think are two recent examples where the Republicans sort of ruled the roost in those states for a long time. And I don't think that the party in power kind of moderated to meet where the public was necessarily, which I think may have helped contribute to, Virginia has become, even though it might elect a Republican governor next Tuesday, certainly at the federal level, Virginia's become pretty Democratic, and of course Arizona voted for Joe Biden for president, first time in the century that it had gone for a Democrat for president. So again, that's not specifically related to gerrymandering, but there is this interesting dynamic where a party might be on the wrong side of demographics. And they don't necessarily change to meet that. They sort of double down on it. I think you could argue that Texas is that way too, although Texas is still a fundamentally Republican state, I think.
I think we have time for about one more question.
Great. This is from David Rowe. How much would voter turnout change if all eligible voters believed their candidate had a chance to win?
Actually, look, we see this all the time, right? We have quite a few league members here. We probably are the largest volunteer-run voter registration organization in the state. And on a regular basis, we hear folks say, why should I vote? Our votes don't matter. It hurts when we hear that as people that just want every voter to show up and vote. I'll say this, bottom line, of course it matters, right? And if nothing else, things like local judicial races matter a lot for our daily lives. But it's absolutely true that what we see, the more government dysfunction we see, the more we see maps that are rigged, the more lame excuses we get as to why government dysfunction has to exist, are really makes a sour taste in folks' mouth, and they decide maybe not to vote, or maybe they vote but they stop calling their lawmakers to tell them what they think, or stop showing up to hearings. And so what I want to say to everyone here is it's frustrating. We're in a scary time for democracy, but it is our democracy. And so we're going to just, let's keep plugging away at this. Let's keep showing up, even when map bakers don't seem to be listening to us, and know that the League has been fighting this for 40 plus years on behalf of Ohio voters. We're not going to stop until we get this right. So please vote. Please show up in any way that you can.
I might reiterate, next Tuesday is Election Day, and last fall in Ohio, 72% of the registered voters voted, but 4 years previous, in municipal election years similar to this one, only 27%. So candidates, issues, do matter in these local elections, including school board races, township trustees, cities, that kind of thing. It's on the ballot, and it might be good to study up in advance, because very few people in this coming election for Tuesday have voted early compared to what happened in the presidential. So there's going to be a lot of people walking in and saying, I didn't know that I vote for the educational resource district, but it is going to be on the ballot in Franklin County. You need to do your homework in advance and vote.
I want to jump in on something too. I want you to notice, I'm 72 years old, but I've surrounded myself with 15 or 20 of the youngest people I know, who are between 35 and 21. Most of them are college graduates. Why? Because we want to get them involved with the process. One thing I learned, persistence, don't go away. It came to a point when I walked in the room, people says, what do you want now, Gresham? That, you can laugh, but that works. It works. And one of the reasons we got this redistricting is because the corporations were tired of paying for campaigns for and against. They got tired. So this fight is not over. The next 30 years, in my opinion, starting in 2024, will make or break this country. Now, I'll support myself by saying this. I was the guy that said if Biden put a black woman as his vice president, he would win. I was the guy that said if Biden put a black woman as his vice president, the black vote would turn out in this country in a way you've never seen it, and particularly in certain critical states like Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. I was wrong. I'm sorry.
So I think that's a good enough place to end it. Sam was wrong. It's important to vote on Tuesday and make your voice heard. So I wish we had more time, but I'm going to turn it back over to Deb for some concluding remarks.
Well, thank you. I hope you found today's forum enlightening and thought-provoking, and you'll go do your homework before next Tuesday if you haven't yet voted. Please join us next Wednesday, if you can, as CMC presents America's Small Business Incubation Rate and What Ohio is Doing Right, with a panel of experts here. Thanks to our online virtual seat patrons and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's forum. And let me also once again thank one of today's sponsors, Hannah News Service, and apologize that I didn't thank previously the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus as a wonderful partner today and sponsor of our forum. Thank you also to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And finally, our special appreciation for today's speakers, Terry Casey, Sam Gresham, Kyle Kondick, Jen Miller, and our host, Jesse Balmer. I suspect Kyle would stick around to sign some books if any of you are interested afterward. Thank you for joining us today. We can't do this without you, and please come back next week as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another community conversation. Thank you.